Microsoft scored a significant win in its attempt to purchase Activision. Let's dive into the new details. Earlier this week, I noted a couple important dates that are coming up in the milestone chart of the Microsoft attempt to buy Activision for about $70 billion dues. Those two dates are October 25th, or roughly the 26th. One of those two dates, Microsoft will drop its earnings release, which is an appropriate venue for discussing this Activision acquisition, which is, again, still hard to say. And then the other date is November 8th. November 8th is when the EU is saying, look, we will make a ruling on what is going on here and what we believe needs to happen for Microsoft to be able to close this deal. Now, outside of that, there are obviously other regulatory bodies that are looking at this purchase as well. Notably, there is the UK, we've already seen that, their competition authority, and then there's other ones like Saudi Arabia, and we've also heard Brazil, and Brazil's making some headlines, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But earlier this year, Saudi Arabia, which I don't think too many people were really thinking was going to be much, either way, they're like, go ahead, buy it, we don't really care, in August. Now, Brazil, which is where a lot of headlines have come out because there's been some conversations about Sony there. There's also been conversations about how Sony is paying effectively game studios to not be on Game Pass and that sort of thing. And so Brazil has been like a little bit of a focal point. And just this week, Brazil has come out and said, Microsoft, go ahead and buy it without any restriction. And now the key there is without any restriction, because I've been purely, somewhat speculating, but I believe that Microsoft would have to make some sort of concessions, at least some demographics. But as of right now, Brazil's like, look, we looked at this, it's fine. And they came out with a pretty important statement here. It said, it's important to highlight that the central objective of CADE, that is the Brazil entity, activity is the protection of the competition of the Brazilian consumers and not the defense of particular interests of specific competitors. That is a direct shot at Sony being like, look, we understand that this probably isn't great for your business, but that is not what we are here to protect. We are here to protect the consumer, which is how it should be. And we're looking at it and we're like, we don't really think so. So Brazil has come out and blessed the acquisition, which is another small win, but notable win for Microsoft in its journey to try to close this deal. Now, in an effort to drum up some more, positive press and spin on it, Microsoft actually has recently put together a website. I don't know why it took them so long to do this, but they've put together a website where they outline why Microsoft buying, or I should say Activision, joining the team Xbox is such a wonderful deal. They've got the benefits for the players, the benefits for the creators, and the benefits for the industry. Now, I do have to point out one thing that I find hilarious, because I would imagine this went through some sort of legal review at the end of the day, and maybe there's a justified reason for why that they wrote it this way. They said benefits of the gaming industry, greater competition in traditional gaming where Sony and Nintendo will remain the biggest. The biggest what? I'm assuming they mean biggest market cap or biggest players, but they just sort of left off like the biggest blah, like they could be they could maybe eating too many carbs. I don't know, the biggest whatever. But either way, Microsoft is attempting with this website to outline their plans and their justification for how this is going to close. Now, this is not all that unusual for a company to put together something like that, because this is $70 billion dues. Now, someone's going to be like, it's 68.9. But if you round it out and count for 3% inflation, actually more inflation at this point, whatever, I'm not even going to go down to that math. Roughly $70 billion. Microsoft is really focusing on how this is going to benefit the industry. And that's probably where the biggest, hang-ups are going to be. Mostly, and if you look at here specifically, they call out a lot of mobile, and Microsoft obviously has missed out massively in the mobile segment. We all know what's happened with Lumia, and we all know what's happened with Windows Phone, and Microsoft was unable to really grab any meaningful market share, and they did a massive write-off and shut all that down, and they effectively don't have a play in the mobile space. So from their perspective, they are looking at this, yes, getting Call of Duty and everything else is fantastic, all those titles are great, but it's really interesting to me, specifically as I kind of, walk through behind the scenes stuff, like how invested Microsoft is in the mobile space. Yes, they have cloud gaming, but they want greater ability to penetrate that market because, as I noted, they don't really have a platform. Yes, they have their productivity apps now out there, but they don't own a platform. But by taking a gaming chunk of the market, it gives them a better, longer horizon in the event, which I don't think is unreasonable to expect, that gaming will become primarily a mobile thing, or at least primary revenue very well will likely be driven by the mobile segment, and Microsoft needs to make sure it is very well suited to be able to capitalize upon that, and that is part of their big argument here about this acquisition. They've got a lot of work still to do. There's the big shoes to drop are still going to be the EU and the US. But by getting Brazil to come out and say no restrictions, and I mean no restrictions at all, is actually very good news for Team Xbox, because they have to prove that this is a good value for the market and the consumers. The creators is an interesting approach too, but I would lump that in for the players. That's all sort of, to me, one. But the big deal is obviously going to be what happens in the market segment. Microsoft is notably, in a conversation with Bloomberg, Satya Nadella said, we're like 4 or 5. And I think he's definitely factoring in their mobile positioning, because I think that is part of the biggest appeal to the company, aside from Call of Duty. Call of Duty is a very unique title, and the fact that it has done so well for so long. Look at Battlefield as an example, has not done really well. Now, you can very much point the fingers at EA for the reasons why Battlefield has not done well, but when it comes to first-person shooters, Call of Duty, as it stands right now, is the primary title. There's a lot of first-person shooters, but when it comes to online multiplayer military type games, Call of Duty is the household brand. It's the crayon, it's the Kleenex, and that is Microsoft wants to be able to leverage that. And obviously, it is why Sony is so nervous at the time. So, as we sit and kind of marinate and wait for the other information to come out, Microsoft is very clearly being informed about what is going on in these agencies. Obviously, by the time it hits the newswire, Microsoft is already well aware and has likely already given a rebuttal or a pushback or whatever else is happening with this acquisition. There's a lot of lobbying going on as well from both Sony and Microsoft to keep this thing moving and in the limelight. I still expect that we're going to start to hear more things like along this Brazil Competition Authority news dropping here in the next 4 to 6 weeks. I think is a fair timeline, especially before the holidays. Nobody really wants to be going through the Christmas holiday season really wondering, like, are we going to be able to do this? And I think that there's some pressure to get it done before then. So what's next? We wait for this news to drop, and then Microsoft actually has to close. Just because they get approval doesn't necessarily mean it's going to close the next day, although I would expect that it would. Microsoft is personally, or I should say financially, preparing for a June 30th, because they actually have to move that money. That's a lot of money that's got to move across the wire, and trust me, I don't think they're using Venmo to do it. And so Microsoft is preparing for that. And then once they get approval from everybody, then they sign the dotted line on the contract. And then there's going to be a transition, typically a small window. And then Microsoft makes the payment, and then they own it, and then we will see what happens to the management team over at Activision. It's already heavily rumored that Bobby will be gone pretty much day one, and I think that's been Microsoft's plan all along, and I continue to believe that it will. But as always with these Activision, or acquisitions, I should say, nothing can change until Microsoft actually makes the payment, and so that is the next big thing we'll be watching for after we get news whether or not it gets approved through regulatory bodies. So, as always, my friends, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.